Last summer, I rented out an Airbnb in Northern California. While scrolling through the app, I discovered a plethora of beautiful homes. However, there was one particular location that piqued my interest, so I decided to look at houses nearby and discovered that there was nearly an entire street of Airbnb rentals. I looked at them all, picked my favorite, and booked it. A month later, I flew in, collected my rental car, and drove an hour to the Airbnb. I pulled into the driveway, and I should mention that it was very late, around 10 or 11. All I wanted to do was bring my belongings inside and crash on the bed. But as soon as I opened my car door, a middle-aged woman from the house next door began waving at me. She was standing in the empty driveway, waving and greeting me in the neighborhood. I smiled and waved back, trying not to get stuck in a conversation. I kept my back to her as I unloaded my suitcase and duffel bag before walking up the driveway to the door. I could see her in the corner of my eye, still standing there, watching me as I approached and entered the Airbnb. I locked the door behind me and shook my head, confused and exhausted. Then I carried everything into the bedroom. The house was nice and appeared to be in order, but I didn't spend much time looking around because I needed to shower right away. Get into bed. I turned on the shower and washed off, but then I heard the doorbell ring. I ignored it, just as I would have if I hadn't been showering. It only rang once, so I assumed they had left, and I didn't even check after drying off, instead going straight to bed. That day, I went into the city and had dinner at a popular restaurant before returning home at 7 p.m. When I arrived, the lady from last night was standing by the front door. She dashed back to her home and went inside. I quickly exited the car and went to the front door, then entered and went inside. I had no idea who this lady was, but the way she bolted when she saw me made me uncomfortable. Over the next hour, I paid close attention to all of the windows, checking to see if that lady had returned. I was sitting in the kitchen with my laptop when something hit the back door. It sounded like a rock had been thrown at it. I glanced over at the door again. A rock was thrown, and this time it struck the back of the house. I stood up and looked out the window. At first, I saw nothing, but as I looked closer, I noticed a small figure standing there and kneeling, picking something up and throwing it right at the window. I backed away in shock, only to realize it was probably that lady. I opened the back door and called them out, telling them to leave. In the darkness, I could barely make out their figures. They were not moving, however. I threatened to call the cops, but they still didn't move. A creepy feeling came over me, and I slid the door shut. I wasn't sure if I wanted to contact the police. I mean, if it was just some crazy lady, I didn't feel particularly threatened. I decided to wait and see what she did. Else, and after a while, it appeared she'd given up. 2 hours later, I retired to bed. By then, I had stopped thinking about the lady. I awoke in the middle of the night, however. Something caught my ear. I wasn't sure what I heard because it was quick and quiet, and I hadn't fully awakened yet, but I knew I heard something. Only a few seconds later, I heard faint footsteps in the hallway outside my room. My eyes widened, and my brain immediately went into fight mode. I jumped out of bed and swung open the door. That lady, barefoot, stood just a few feet away in my hallway. She dashed back and left the house. I followed her out the front door and watched her return inside her home. Then I locked the front door and called the cops. They knocked on the lady's door to confront her, but she did not answer. We discovered that her house was also an Airbnb, owned by the same person who rented mine. However, no one had booked that house, so the lady must have known the code and had been staying there for several days. We couldn't find any reason for her to be after me, or any indication of who she was or where she had gone. I left that night and flew home. I wasn't sure what she was going to do. If I hadn't woken up, but she was still out there, I didn't want to stay and find out. This happened a few weeks ago, and I work at a 24-hour drive-through restaurant. I'm a crew manager, but I mostly just cook and take orders like everyone else. We always have at least 2 people working overnight. One is a manager, and the other is usually a cook. On this particular night, the cook called in sick, and when I asked the others if they could cover his shift, none of them said they could. So by 12 a.m., I was the only worker there. Now, the restaurant usually doesn't get busy overnight, and more employees arrive at 4 a.m., so it wasn't an entire shift alone. But it did mean that I had to do everything myself for 4 hours. I left my headset on in case someone came through the drive-thru and began working on the tasks I had for the night. I began by scraping and cleaning the stovetops, but was interrupted a few minutes later by a banging sound from the front of the restaurant. I walked down and looked over the counter to see a man standing at the front door, banging on it. Then he pressed his face against the glass and looked inside, scanning the entire room before his gaze settled on me. I walked over to the door as he stared at me, and when I got close, he backed up and waited, as if he expected me to open it. "Daren't." I yelled through the glass that our dine-in area was closed, and that he needed to use the drive-thru to place an order. He seemed perplexed, so I yelled again that the doors were locked and he needed to use the drive-thru. He made no response at the time, leaving me to wonder whether he understood what I was saying. So I turned around and walked back into the kitchen. I figured he'd pick up on the fact that the doors weren't opening eventually. I continued working on the stove tops for at least 15 to 20 minutes. Throughout this time, I had gone to the front to see if the man had left, and from what I could see, he had. The entire parking lot was empty, and the man was not at the door, but I received an alert from my headset a few minutes after finishing with the stoves that someone was in the drive-thru. I turned on my microphone and asked for their order while walking to the window, but no one responded. When I got to the window, I noticed on the camera that there was no car outside. I looked around the screen and saw no movement either, so I ignored it and began walking back. But as I approached the back room, I came to a stop because I thought I heard something. I stood still and listened as footsteps walked slowly above me on the roof of the building. They were careful steps, with only the roof creaking, but I had no doubt that someone was up there. I followed the sound of their footsteps, staring down the ceiling until I saw the ladder leading to the maintenance hatch, at which point I realized what they were doing. I dashed over to the ladder and began looking for some sort of lock to prevent the hatch from opening, but I'd never used it before, so I had no idea how it worked or whether it even locked. Then I heard a loud creak from the ceiling directly above me, followed by a few thuds from outside of the hatch. A moment has passed. The hatch creaked open slightly, and all I saw through the small gap was a pair of eyes staring back at me. I dashed towards the front of the building, hearing loud thuds from where the hatch was. I quickly unlocked the door and dashed toward my car. As I sat inside the restaurant, frantically looking through the windows, I called the police. While on the phone, I noticed a shadow move past the front counter. Then a man appeared, standing in the far back of the restaurant but looking my way. After a moment, he turned and vanished behind the kitchen, leaving me in a panic until the cops arrived. They searched inside and out, including on the roof, but the man had already fled. Nothing from the location was missing either. Neither equipment nor money were taken. Nothing. He simply broke in and left. I tried not to think about it too much, but it's difficult not to believe that he was there for me. As I previously stated, this occurred recently, so there is currently little information available. Despite having his face captured on camera, his identity has yet to be confirmed. The building's owner did, however, add a padlock to the inside of the hatch, which should have been done sooner, but I suppose it was simply an inconvenience. I'm still worried about the man's intentions, and whether he's waiting for me to be alone again, ready to do whatever he tried before. Over the last 5 years, I've worked at various odd jobs across the country. I live in a van, so I travel a lot, but a few months of the year I have to stay in one place for an extended period of time in order to save money before moving on. At the time, I was living in Utah's Mid-East region and working. Three summers ago, I rented an Airbnb near my family in Arizona. I'd used Airbnb numerous times before and had excellent experiences, often skipping hotels entirely and instead searching for Airbnb. When I arrived at this rental, I did what I always do when I go on vacation. It was just after 9 p.m. and I approached the door. It had a keypad on the handle, so I pulled out my phone to see if I had been emailed the code. But before I could check, the door opened. A man greeted me as the Airbnb host and invited me in. I'd never met an Airbnb host because they always had a key or code to get into the house, and I never specified when I'd be arriving, so he had to have been waiting for me or were just at the rental for some reason. Even more surprising, he began giving me a tour of the home. I didn't say much because I was confused and didn't know what to make of it, but the man talked nonstop. After we walked to the house, he asked if I had everything I needed and then left. I arranged my belongings in the room, called my parents to let them know I had arrived in town, and went to bed. To satisfy my paranoia, I went for a more personal walk through the house in the morning, checking for hidden cameras and such. As I did, I noticed that one of the doors that the host described as a closet had a lock on it and could not be opened. I assumed it was for cleaning supplies or other items the host had in storage and didn't think much of it. I spent most of the day with my family, eating out and walking around the parks. I returned to Airbnb just after sunset. I entered through the front door and began preparing to shower, but the power went out within 5 minutes. I searched through the darkness for my phone and turned on the flashlight. I had nothing running that could cause a shortage, so I had no idea why this was happening. I looked through the rooms for the breaker box but couldn't find it anywhere. After 15 minutes without power and no luck finding the switches, I texted the host. He quickly replied, telling me to wait a minute, and then there was a knock at the door. Through the peephole, I noticed the host standing on the porch. I opened the door, and he quickly entered, already holding a flashlight. He said he was just a few streets down when I texted him, but he arrived so quickly and even had a flashlight ready, so I was already put off. I had a bad feeling about this as I followed him until he came to a stop by the locked closet. He took out a key and opened it, asking me to hold the flashlight for him while he entered. When I shined it into the closet, I discovered a staircase that led to a basement. It caught me off guard and immediately made me uncomfortable. He got halfway down before turning and asking me to bring down the light so he could see. Maybe it was the way he said it, or just a sudden click in my head, that made me reflect on everything and how unnecessary it was that I had to be the one holding the flashlight and accompany him down there. It made me wonder if he was trying to trick me into following him into the basement, which he had never mentioned before. Without saying anything, I backed away and fled the house, calling the cops as I hid next to a neighboring home. The host did not follow me and even stayed when the police arrived. When questioned, he claimed it was all a misunderstanding. However, when the police searched the house, they discovered that the electrical box was on the outside of the house, behind a bush, and the power switch had been manually turned off. The basement was completely empty. Regardless, nothing was enough to prove anything, and the situation reached a stalemate. I'm willing to bet my life that he was the one who turned off the power, but what he planned to do once he got me into the basement is something I can't even imagine.